Welcome to episode 94 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first line-by-line review of the poem, and we've temporarily turned to a presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's Own Ends, as narrated by Torquatus. But before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, which is not the same as presented by many modern commentators. We hope that our fresh perspective will encourage you to rethink the meaning of Epicurean philosophy for yourself. Second, we won't be talking about contemporary philosophical or political issues in this podcast, and in fact we'll stay as far away from them as possible. We want everyone to understand that Epicurus had a unique philosophy of his own. Epicurus was not a Stoic, a humanist, a Buddhist, a Taoist, an atheist, a Marxist, or a modern politician of the left or right. And it is very unfair to Epicurus and to ourselves to try to force Epicurean philosophy into one of those modern boxes. Third, Lucretius's poem is mainly concerned with the many details of Epicurean physics, but we'll always try to learn from those details what they mean for the best way to live our own lives. Lucretius will show that Epicurus was not obsessed with luxury, but neither did he teach minimalism or asceticism, as you often find written on the internet today. Epicurus taught that pleasure is the ultimate guide of life, not supernatural gods, not the abstractions of idealism, and not absolute notions of virtue. Epicurus taught that there are no supernatural beings, no fate, and no life after death. That means that any happiness we'll ever have must come in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive to you, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com. There you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Now let's join our panel for today's discussion, with Don reading today's text.
But that I may make plain to you the source of all the mistakes made by those who inveigh against pleasure and eulogize pain, I will unfold the whole system and will set before you the very language held by that great discoverer of truth and that master builder, if I may style him so, of the life of happiness. Surely no one recoils from or dislikes or avoids pleasure in itself because it is pleasure, but because great pains come upon those who do not know how to follow pleasure rationally. Nor again is there any one who loves or pursues or wishes to win pain on its own account, merely because it is pain, but rather because circumstances sometimes occur which compel him to seek some great pleasure at the cost of exertion and pain. To come down to petty details, who among us ever undertakes any toilsome bodily exercise except in the hope of gaining some advantage from it? Who again would have any right to reproach either a man who desires to be surrounded by pleasure unaccompanied by any annoyance, or another man who shrinks from any pain which is not productive of pleasure? But in truth, we do blame and deem most deserving of righteous hatred the men who, enervated and depraved by the fascination of momentary pleasures, do not foresee the pains and troubles which are sure to befall them because they are blinded by desire, and in the same error are involved those who prove traitors to their duties through effeminacy of spirit. I mean because they shun exertions and trouble. Now it's easy and simple to mark the difference between these cases. For at our seasons of ease, when we have untrammeled freedom of choice, and when nothing debars us from the power of following the course that pleases us best, then pleasure is wholly a matter for our selection and pain for our rejection. On certain occasions, however, either through the inevitable call of duty or through stress of circumstances, it will often come to pass that we must put pleasures from us and make no protest against annoyance. So in such cases, the principle of selection adopted by the wise man is that he should either by refusing certain pleasures attain to other and greater pleasures, or by enduring pains should ward off pains still more severe. Holding as I do this theory, what reason should I have for fearing that I may not be able to bring our Torquati into accord with it? You, a little while ago, showed at once your copious memory and your friendly and kindly feeling for me by quoting their examples. Yet you neither perverted me by eulogizing my ancestors, nor made me less vigorous in my reply. Now I ask, what interpretation do you put upon the actions of these men? Do you believe that they attacked the armed foe or practiced such cruelty towards their own children and their own flesh and blood absolutely without giving a thought to their own interest or their own advantage? Why, even the beasts do not act so as to produce such a tumult and confusion that we cannot see the purpose of their movements and attacks. Do you believe that men so exceptional achieved such great exploits from no motive whatever? What the motive was, I shall examine presently. Meanwhile, I shall maintain this, that if they performed those actions which are beyond question noble from some motive, their motive was not virtue apart from all else. He stripped the foe of his necklet. Yes, and he donned it himself to save his own life. But he faced a great danger. Yes, with the whole army looking on. What did he gain by it? Applause and affection, which are the strongest guarantees for passing life in freedom from fear. He punished his son with death. If purposelessly, I should be sorry to be descended from one so abominable and so cruel. But if he did it to enforce by his self-inflicted pain the law of military command, and by fear of punishment to control the army in the midst of a most critical war, then he had in view the preservation of his fellow countrymen, which he knew to involve his own. And these principles have a wide application. There's one field in which the eloquence of your school has been wont especially to vaunt itself, and your own eloquence in particular, for you are an eager investigator of the past. I mean the stories of illustrious and heroic men and the applause of their actions viewed as looking not to any reward, but to the inherent comeliness of morality. All such arguments are upset when once the principle of choice which I have just described has been established, whereby either pleasures are neglected for the purpose of obtaining pleasures still greater, or pains are incurred for the sake of escaping still greater pains.
Don, thank you for reading that. Last week was one of our longest episodes in the history of our podcast, and this week could follow along in the same line. There's so much in this material, and this particular text is so important in understanding Epicurean philosophy and really brings right in front of you some of the most controversial issues that people don't always talk about on the internet. But we are going to talk about them and dive into the most controversial aspects of Epicurean philosophy. Anybody want to say anything in general before we get started? Because especially in the first couple of passages we have today, I almost think we're going to need to go line by line. There's so much in them that's worthy of comment. But before we get started, we have our usual panel, Martin, Joshua, and Don. So any general comments before we get started?
Let's dive right in.
The very first line, but that I may make plain to you the source of all the mistakes made by those who inveigh against pleasure and eulogize pain. Who is he talking about? What's going on there? Why is he even talking about the mistake of those who criticize pleasure and praise pain? Do such people really exist?
Yeah, certainly his chief target here, I imagine, is going to be the Stoics, who are, if not necessarily eulogizing pain, they're seeing it as enduring pain is a virtue or a duty, and that pleasure is a distraction. And as he says later, it's enervating. Not just a distraction, but it's a sort of a moral failure for someone who views duty or honor or a virtue as the highest good.
We could spend the rest of the day talking about that very subject. And of course, this is written by Cicero in around 50 BC. So this is not Epicurus himself or the original Epicureans talking. This is someone who has lived through an ensuing 200 years of Stoic obnoxiousness and criticism of pleasure.
Not that you feel strongly about it.
No, not at all. Not at all. But many people who are probably listening to this podcast are going to come to this idea that the Stoics, they don't really criticize pleasure. They want pleasure of a different kind. They want you to be calm and so forth. And many of these modern Stoics do not even admit that Stoicism praises pain and criticizes pleasure in the same way that the ancient Stoics did. So one of the premises people need to understand is that when you dig back into the origins of Stoicism, it is very plain the Stoics considered, and not only the Stoics, but to some extent, I think Plato and Aristotle and many of the other Greeks, they considered pleasure to be a disruption from the life of wisdom, from the ability to calmly and rationally assess everything in life and to contemplate truth and so forth. So they don't consider pleasure just to be what's the word the Stoics like to use? Indifferent, right. It's not just an indifferent. It's actually something to be avoided so that you can be serious and focus every bit of energy that you have on the pursuit of virtue.
And that's exactly why the Stoics and that whole strain of thought was preserved by the Christians, because the Christians saw it as the suffering servant and, endure pain and pleasures of sin and all that sort of thing. So that's why the Stoics got transmitted and Epicurus' books got burnt.
Don, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be my next point. As Cassius said, this is roughly 50 BC. This is too early to be criticizing Christianity. But
it's never too early for that. Sorry.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. But we have talked a little bit about St. Jerome, because St. Jerome is the transmitter of one of the only, and probably spurious, biographical details about Lucretius's life. But if you look at a painting, almost any painting of St. Jerome, he is almost always pictured with a rock in his hand. And that rock, the purpose of the rock was so that he could beat his own chest bloody as atonement. And part of what he was atoning for, as he records in this sort of hallucinatory dream in which he encounters God face to face, part of what he's atoning for is the pleasure he gets from reading Cicero. So beating his own chest with a rock, beating himself bloody with a rock, that seems to me to be eulogizing pain in a sense, and certainly inveighing against pleasure. So you're absolutely right to make that point.
Yeah, and I always think of the medieval, believe they were called the flagellants, that would walk through the towns whipping themselves and stuff like that.
But these things are actually against Christian doctrine. No?
Well, how do you mean? At least not at the time, I don't think.
How do you mean, Martin?
At least nowadays, for example, there's still some practice like this in the Philippines, and this is not supported by the Vatican. The Vatican advises against it.
Well, I think it might even be the same as, like, if you look at the modern Stoics and their relation to this whole concept too. I mean, I think they've come to realize that this isn't good. I don't know what's the good advertising.
Good optics.
There you go. Exactly. And I think there's like, but I think, back in the day, it was all about suffering and pain, and, you are sinful creatures and you need to atone for your sins. And even Jesus atoned for the sins of the world through being killed and whipped and all that sort of thing. So, it's that whole strain of the pain and the suffering is good. It's a long, long history, I think, in Christian circles, and maybe not as much as Stoics, but that's,
It still doesn't make sense within Christian doctrine. Because in that Christian doctrine, you got life as a gift from God. And if you damage that life by intentionally hurting yourself, you basically distance yourself from God. So I think there's also Christianism is actually in the Jewish tradition of valuing life high. No? And so that's why I think also at that time there must have been Christians, intellectual Christians, who knew this and who would not praise this kind of misguided action.
Well, Martin, you're certainly right that Christianity values life, but Christians are supposed to view themselves as being in this world, but not of this world. The life that they value is the chance that this life gives them to partake in the eternal life to come hereafter. And if pleasure is the road to sin, then an argument can be made within Christian theology that you need to harden the flesh against pleasure and against the desire for pleasure, specifically to protect life. In other words, to protect the life to come.
Yeah, but you still shouldn't endanger your life by hurting yourself.
Oh, yeah. St. Jerome was one of the church fathers, though, so he's beating himself with a rock. So
the translator of the Vulgate Bible that became the text of the Catholic Church for centuries.
It's not a practice which most other church fathers did.
Well, did St. Augustine throw himself into a thorn bush?
I think there are other examples. I'm not able to quote them. I think there's one or two of them that like cut off their genitals or something and things like that were examples of, there's a word for that when you not cauterize, but when you just
castrate.
Well, that's true too. That I wasn't thinking of that word as much as I was. There's some other general word for when you inoculate. Well, inoculate's not exactly the right one either, but it's kind of topical. But when you do something to yourself to harden yourself against some other problem.
I think I can't think of the word, but I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But it's always interesting to hear Martin's perspective because he's from Europe and things are somewhat different at times in Europe from the United States. It's interesting, Martin, that there's still a strong, I think, strain of that over in the United States, especially in some Catholic circles. For some reason, what comes to mind is Mel Gibson and his Passion of the Christ movie. I mean, I watched some of that some years ago when it came out, and it's just, they glory in the suffering of Jesus. The suffering of Jesus is what saves humanity. So, my gosh, we could not spend the whole podcast. We could spend the whole year talking about those issues of how that suffering, the suffering servant of God, the Lamb of God, is what saves humanity from the lure of the world, which is really the pleasure of the world.
Yep.
But
God.
This was the privilege of Jesus only. It's not the job of the ordinary Christian to incur the same thing.
Martin is, I think, lobbying to become the next pope after the current one because you're listing the only things that could possibly make sense out of the whole mishmash of whatever you want to call it, Martin. I certainly appreciate and agree that the statements you're making, they do make sense. And to relate that back to the road that Don was starting down a few minutes ago, it's kind of like the same thing as with modern Stoicism. The modern Stoics realize that the optics of pursuing virtue as an end in itself are really not of interest to 99% of the people in the world. And so they've just cut out the whole history and the whole background and the whole rationale of Stoicism, which was originally a theistic, fate-oriented idea of everything is divine and everything is going to work out, almost in the Christian sense of everything works out for good for those who love the Lord or something like that. It's a deeply religious, from my point of view, orientation towards life that Stoicism brings. But the modern Stoics have just absolutely backed away and attempted to cut out, or again, cauterize all of that, it seems to me. There's some of them who are consistent with it and talk about the history and point out this contradiction, but the great majority of them are basically psychologists and are into things like dialectical behavioral therapy and so forth. And they talk as if pleasure is all.
And it's very strong with like the manly man, stand up to your pain, take a cold shower sort of strain too. So,
but they try to avoid even this issue of, well, why are we doing this? They do praise the pain, but they imply that they're almost Epicurean. They imply that what they're doing in being so hard is that it's going to bring a reward to them in terms of implicitly happiness is what these modern Stoics talk about. They have set for themselves the goal of happiness through this pain issue, which I think the ancient Stoics would totally.
I would amend that just a little. It's not the pain itself; it's the overcoming the pain. Look at me, how it's the virtue of overcoming the pain. I can endure this.
But they don't get clear about why.
Right.
What is the reward in the end of overcoming this pain?
The enduring is the sort of the end in of itself almost.
But the deeper you dig into it, in my reading in the past, the ancient Stoics were very clear that virtue was supposed to be its own reward. And in fact, if you were looking for some reward as a result of going through all this pain and effort, you were by definition not included in those who are truly virtuous. You've shown by the fact that you're looking for a reward that you don't understand Stoicism at all. And you're not even anywhere near the mountaintop of virtue that you're supposed to be ever climbing towards.
So you were right, Cassius. We're not past line 2.
Exactly right. And we're not even past line 1 yet, because I don't want to go past line 1 without commenting that Epicurus was the great discoverer of truth and the master builder of human happiness. Now, I think I'm using the Rackham version when I say master builder of human happiness, but those words have always echoed in my mind ever since I've read them too, that he's the architect of human happiness when we say master builder.
I found it interesting to go back to the Latin on the Reed version. It's the life of happiness is how he translates it in English. In Latin, it's beati vitae, or to give it the ecclesiastical pronunciation, beati vitae. And that translates directly from the Greek for the Makarios Zane, a blessed life, a happy life, fortunate life, prosperous life, and that Epicurus uses Makarios Zane in the letter to Menoikeus. So that's a direct translation there, I'm going to say, straight from the Greek.
I guess they considered blessed to be about their word of highest praise, even though, and not necessarily in a religious context.
And that's the same word where the Beatitudes come from. Blessed are the meek, blessed are this, blessed are that. So it's the same exact Latin word used in the Beatitudes. So it's that sort of blessedness and happiness and fortunate and that sort of context.
We'll go past the first sentence, but again, those are the two aspects of Epicurus that I think that people should never let it out of their mind, that he may be the master builder of happiness, and of course that's a huge, huge achievement, but he's also the great discoverer of truth. Mm-hmm. The two things go hand in hand and are not separate and are important to keep together, because you're not really going to understand what he means by the life of happiness and how he's constructing it unless you understand the truth of his viewpoint of the nature of the universe.
Another line there that I want to point out just real quick is the one where it says that for those who do not know how to follow pleasure rationally. So that's one of my hobby horses about that reason is not thrown out the window by Epicurus, but it's a vehicle to make the right choices to follow pleasure.
That's right. I'm talking too much. Joshua and Martin.
One thing I want to keep in mind as we go forward here, he's going to give a couple of examples of people who, choose pain because it yields greater pleasure later on and all that. We've talked about, why should you pursue pleasure? But there's a real idea in Epicurean philosophy that the pursuit of pleasure is a description of nature as it is, not a prescription for human behavior as it should be. So this is something to keep in mind. It's pleasure as descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's not you should pursue pleasure. It's whatever you're doing, in a way you already are pursuing pleasure. So to bring it back to the word rational, the rational pursuit of pleasure is to understand that you are already pursuing pleasure, and now you're going to try and figure out how to do it more intelligently.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
One of the things I hear you saying there, Joshua, is just the consistency of the approach here, that you're not bucking against nature by any means in pursuing pleasure. You're just basically following what nature has constructed you to do.
Yeah, because he's going to get into, this discussion of his ancestors as we go forward here. And Torquatus had some very notable, historically important ancestors in the Roman Republic. And some of them did noble things. Some of them did horrible things. But the point he's trying to make is that in every single case, the pursuit of pleasure is behind everything they're doing. It's not necessarily the direct course they're taking. They're not reaching out for pleasure directly, but they're doing these sometimes horrible things because they expect that pleasure, not just for themselves, but for their countrymen, is going to be the result of that.
Joshua, I think you're making the main point of the presentation here. But before we go further and continue to hit on that particular point, I don't want to miss another opportunity to slam the Stoics here, because one of the things I'd like to point out here is that it seems to me, I look at this paragraph sometimes and I think to myself, he's being too charitable to the Stoics, because when he talks about people who don't know how to pursue pleasure rationally, he's being nice to them. He's giving them an out in my mind, because in my mind, especially these original Stoic leaders, they knew exactly what they were doing. And of course, he's used the word mistake earlier in this passage as well. And I'm perfectly happy with giving to anybody that we come into contact with nowadays the benefit of the doubt that they're just mistaken, that they don't understand the philosophy, that they don't know how to follow pleasure rationally, but that if they did, they would understand exactly where Epicurus is coming from. But I do not think that applies to everybody. I do believe that there are people, and I don't know necessarily whether they're psychologically corrupted, but there are people who have actually embraced pain knowingly, not just because they're in error, but because they're really corrupted or perverted in their goals for philosophy and their goals for life. So I'll drop that point there. But it's interesting to me here that in this paragraph, he's setting it out from a perspective that I think is actually too nice to them, and that people need to understand when they read these philosophies that it's not just a matter of mistakes sometimes. Mistake is clearly part of it, but at some point you've got to realize that not everybody's your friend and not everybody's trying to assist you. and that there are people in the world who would prefer to manipulate you and take advantage of you. And you've just got to be very careful about which type you're dealing with at any particular time. When he's talking to Cicero here, I mean, I'm sure he gave Cicero the benefit of the doubt that he was a friend of his and they were all ultimately supportive of each other. But I don't think that presumption extends across the board universally to everybody that people come across. Okay, end of that particular attack on the Stoics. Maybe we can begin to move past the first passage, but the latter part of the first passage is making the argument about who of us ever does anything unless we hope to gain some advantage from it. That's what Joshua was just talking about. And then the last question of the first paragraph is, who would have any right to criticize somebody who pursues pleasure if it's unaccompanied by any annoyance? I guess what he's saying there is if there's no cost to pursuing that pleasure in terms of pain or any other disruption, why should you not pick up a rose and smell it? Or why should you not take advantage of some pleasure that's open to you if there's no negative result of it?
Which I think puts us right into section or line 33 there. My contention is that is a restatement of Principal Doctrine 10 right there at the beginning of 33. Okay,
and of course, to remind everybody what 10 is, that's the one who you want to read it, or do you want to reference it in paraphrased form?
That's a good, you know what, that's a good idea. Hold on one second, I can pull it up here real quick. Man, you're making me cite my sources. Jeez, oh man.
The magic of Audacity will allow us to cut out the delay here.
Exactly. It'll be seamless. You're also patient. I appreciate that.
I'm insulted that you don't have it memorized. I would think you'd memorize it by now, Don.
Exactly. So I guess I have a Hicks translation pulled up here. Okay, so the Principal Doctrine 10, translated by Hicks, is if the objects which are productive of pleasures to profligate persons really freed them from fears of the mind, the fears I mean inspired by celestial and atmospheric phenomena, the fear of death, the fear of pain, if further they taught them to limit their desires, then we should not have any reason to censure such persons, for they would then be filled with pleasure to overflowing on all sides and would be exempt from all pain, whether of body or mind, that is, from all evil. And so my contention is that right here at the beginning of section 33 is that he's basically restating that, because he's saying for in truth, we do blame and deem most deserving of righteous hatred those who do not foresee the pains and troubles which are sure to befall them because they are blinded by desire. So he's not saying that I hate the word profligate, but what the profligates do is, pleasurable. There's no question that it's pleasurable, but you need to determine whether it's going to bring you greater pain in the end or not. And the people who just follow pleasure blindly and not rationally are going the wrong direction. Discuss.
Yeah, I was waiting for Joshua or Martin.
Well, I'd like to talk a minute about Cicero himself, because, he obviously does not view pleasure as the goal of life. There's a book, one of the early books written in Latin, I believe, by Cato the Elder, and it's called De Re Rustica. And it's all about how to manage your country estate, your farm, basically, your villa. And he presents it, if I remember correctly, as this, the duty of the Roman landowner is that this is not something you're doing for fun. This is like your social obligation as a member of the equestrian class or the noble class. And Cicero certainly had land in the countryside. And the way he talks about pleasure, it's as if he doesn't see that his own villa, is his own land. He had land in Tusculum, at Cumae he had land. And so he's presenting that as a duty, or he seems to. But, from my point of view, it's like, wow, it must be so horrible to have this grave task of managing your country villa, your estate, for the duty and glory of Rome. That must be just awful for you, Cicero. I can see how that would not be pleasurable at all. But
let me tie that together with what Don was just saying, because as I was listening to the direction, it took me a second to try to relate those two, but I think they're closely related. The issue that I think we need to grapple with, or one of the issues, would be that Torquatus is talking here as if everybody would agree, of course, that pleasure is desirable in itself, and that nobody would have any right to criticize pleasure except for the fact that it brings bad consequences. I don't think that is a given. And that's exactly what I think that Joshua has just brought up, is that not everybody agrees that pleasure is desirable in itself at all. Cicero may have seen his properties there as something that he considered to be a duty or part of his virtue as a Roman citizen. And I don't know that Cicero would agree with this argument that the only reason to object to pleasure is because it brings pain. I'm seeing this as a sort of an insider Epicurean argument for the moment that I think people need to understand, that everybody doesn't even accept this perspective, because these people who push virtue say that virtue is its own reward, virtue is the reward, and pleasure is not even to be part of the equation. So the interesting thing to me is as we relate Principal Doctrine 10, which Don has brought up, and these questions here, I think they make sense and they're persuasive only to a certain group of people to some extent.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think Cicero would have viewed pleasure as something good in itself, which is why I say I think that when he's talking about his wealth and his status in the government of the city of Rome, his quaestorship in Sicily, which I'll probably get into a little later in this passage, like I said, his country estates, which he's managing, I don't think he would see that as being directed toward the end of pleasure, because he doesn't see pleasure. He doesn't admit to seeing pleasure as being good in itself.
And I think using the word admit there is probably a good thing too, because it all depends how you're going to define it as well. I mean, you can define a way that you're actually, because he obviously gets some sort of pleasurable feeling from it. I refuse to believe he wouldn't do it, but you can define that away. You can, it's like, well, it's not really pleasure that I feel. I feel the duty that I am doing to Rome and my virtue and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, maybe, yeah, but I don't think so.
Yeah, when I think of Cicero, one of the things I think about is sort of the embodiment of human vanity. I think Cicero was an incredibly vain person. He really, really cared about his reputation, and he would not want people to think of him as being someone hopelessly lost in the pursuit of pleasure. So
Right. Yep. Oh, I would agree. Yeah, definitely. He was like the Roman par excellence as far as that goes.
That is why I sometimes sound like I'm joking when I'm criticizing the Stoics, but that's I think the practical part of the practical reason that it's good to keep this difference between the Stoics and Epicureans in mind is because these people that you're talking about have been very clear in their philosophy that pleasure is not the goal, and pain is not only not to be avoided, but pain is actually something that's good to endure. So you do have to think about where people are coming from and appreciate that if you don't accept the premise that pleasure is ultimately the highest good, the direction to go in, then you're not going to accept this argument that he's making here right now.
Right.
It gets complicated and subtle, and I know I personally don't do a very good job of articulating it, but I think that that's one of the levels that people need to really think about in all of the philosophy here, is how important it is to zero in ultimately on what the goal is, because to a large extent, everything else revolves around that. Joshua, you may have had a different place that you planned to insert it, but before we started recording today, you brought it back to mind a passage from Lucretius. I think would apply here. It apply many places during our discussion today, but what was the one that you cited? Do you remember what book it was from?
I do. Yeah, this is the perfect place for it, I think. This is Lucretius. This is book 2 at about line 170. I think it's 170 in the Loeb edition. I've got two different translations here of the section, and I'm coming into this right in the middle of a line, so because it's a rather long paragraph. But in the Loeb edition, he says, "Which divine pleasure, the guide of life," and in Latin that is dux vitae, "persuades men to approach, herself leading them and coaxing them through the ways of Venus to beget their generations, that the human race may not come to an end." And in the Rolfe Humphreys translation, it's "our guide to life, the radiance of pleasure." So it's interesting here that Lucretius is not using the word summum bonum, the highest good, and he's not using the word telos, which means end in Greek. He's using the guide to life, the guide to life. Pleasure, in a sense, here occupies a separate category from good. Which I think helps us to get a little bit out of the weeds that we fell into on the last episode, where we kind of got bogged down talking about, is pleasure the only good, or are there other goods? rational goods besides pleasure. Or Don, what was that word you used?
The instrumental good?
Yeah, instrumental good. So he's taking pleasure and he's putting it in its own separate category, the guide of life.
Joshua, I don't want you to lose your train of thought and I can see here Don's about to say something too, but I want to insert there the preceding section, if I recall correctly, that you have omitted in reading the quote, is that issue came up because Lucretius was talking about those people who assert that gods are necessary to have all these things happen. He's talking about the fact that it's not necessary for there to be gods to control the universe and move it in a particular direction, because in the place of gods, which do not exist, the force that performs that function is divine pleasure, the guide of life.
That's a great point you make, because that's the first part of that line. He says, but some, and then every edition you'll see a little footnote mark there because they want to say, Stoics and Platonists is who he's talking about here. And in book 1, in the sort of the hymn to Venus, he actually uses an entirely different word for pleasure or for Venus. He says, sola gubernas, you alone govern the nature of things.
Way are you saying the Dux Vitae?
You said ducks. I feel like I must be channeling Mussolini or something. Yes, exactly. I think Il Duce or whatever they used to say in Italy there. Dux Vitae. One thing that has always seemed to me to be what ought to be an obvious question is, why isn't in the first couple of principal doctrines, where is it in those principal doctrines that pleasure is the guide of life? There are things from which you can derive that, but that's one of the reasons I keep that quote from Lucretius that Joshua has reminded us of in my mind, because that actually, I think, is what it comes down to. And one of the most succinct phrases, even, of course, there's all sorts of things in the letter to Menicius about how pleasure is the beginning and the end of a blessed life and so forth. But I would add right up there, if you're looking for passages from Epicurean philosophy that support this idea that pleasure is the ultimate goal or the ultimate guide, that turn of phrase from Lucretius is one of the best.
And that really brings up. I'm sorry, Joshua. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to make a few points about that Latin word dux or dukes. That word has a huge amount of English derivatives. Education is a word because education is designed, or it was designed, to create leaders. Air ducts are, this sort of metal infrastructure that leads air from one place to another. So I think there's maybe an analogy in that word somewhere, but even the word deductive logic, because in a particular form of logic, the premises are, the form of the argument necessarily leads to the conclusion. Whether the conclusion is true or not is a separate question, but the form of the argument necessarily leads to that conclusion. Yeah,
and this discussion is right up my alley, because, anytime you're going to talk about the different ways that original Latin words can be interpreted, that's why I think it's so important to go back to the original Latin and Greek and see how those words were understood back then, and not to be satisfied with one English translation out there.
Okay, now that you've said that, I have to mention our friend Godfrey, who posted something very recently about the word that jumps out that I remember I was talking about and joking about was that he takes that originalist viewpoint without deviating into politics and so forth in terms of American constitutional law and so forth, whether you should have an originalist view of the Constitution or whether the Constitution is a living document. That's the point I wanted to raise here. I'm thinking that Epicurus and the Epicureans saw pleasure as the living leader of life, not as something that's absolute, something that you can find written in stone version that applies to everybody all the time, every place and so forth. Pleasure is a living, in a sense, leader. It only has any meaning to those who are living, that's for sure. There's one thing that we talk about pretty regularly. But that's, I think, part of this aspect of things, too. That's the point Joshua raised. Whether you talk about the highest good, which to me rings of a very philosophical, conceptual viewpoint, or whether you consider it to be the leader or the goal, especially leader. Leader is somebody who's something that's living, something that's interacting with you moment by moment, that you might be moving off in a different direction depending on which way your leader is taking you.
To be pedantic at this point, I really like the translation of guide rather than leader, because a guide sort of, at least for me, has a connotation of like a companion or something like that that you come along with them, that it's not going to impose things on you. You choose to follow a guide or not. Whereas leader is like, here, I'm going to take you by the hand. I'm going to take you where you need to go. Whereas, pleasure is there. Pleasure is available. Pleasure can show you the way, but, it's not going to impose its will upon you. You have agency to do whatever you want to do.
Martin, that would be a place I'd really be interested in your point of view. What about your perspective, Martin, in terms of guide and leader? Do you have any thoughts about that as the role that pleasure has?
I mean, the word of guide makes sense, but I would point out another use of this word dux. I think duce should be derived from this one too. And this is how Mussolini, one of the worst dictators in 20th century, called himself. So he was not just a guide who you could follow or not. It was a dictator whom you had to follow.
I see that as the point that Don has just raised, that there's definitely subtleties of difference between words like leader versus guide. And I certainly agree with Don that guide has much more of the, although it depends, I guess, again, like everything else does, on your perspective. I suppose it would be one of these things where if you were analogizing pleasure as Venus, then perhaps I can see justification for saying that Venus is your leader, but you'd have to be very clear about your context and what you were talking about.
And consider, too, that the Latin dux also gave rise to the English word duke.
Mm-hmm. But, Martin, the reason I asked for your comment, what do you think in terms of, you made the distinction between the words there, but do you have any thoughts about, some people might take this discussion into the direction of free will and so forth, in the sense that nature, you not only don't think about whether something is pleasurable or painful to you, and I guess in a strong sense, you really don't have any choice about whether something is pleasurable or painful to you.
But you have a choice whether you're going to pay attention to it or not. I mean, I think that's the whole idea of pleasure and pain as feelings. That, I mean, it's a natural reaction to something, literally something that happens to you, the pathe. But whether you decide to pursue one direction or the other is
absolutely. So. Absolutely. Joshua and Mark, what do y'all think about this issue? Do you agree that pleasure and pain are things that are, I guess you don't have a choice as to whether you find something pleasurable or painful or not, do you, or do you?
We can somewhat choose how much attention we pay, like Don just mentioned. But other than that, it's something what just comes up in the situation, and it is just that feeling as it comes up. So that means the only way we can influence it directly is then that we make our decision before what action we take, so that what pleasure or pain is coming our way.
Joshua?
Yeah, I think there is a sense in which you can sort of train or lead yourself to
guide yourself.
Maybe it's by exposure or guide yourself. You can lead. For example, I really used to hate mushrooms. I didn't like eating them. I didn't want them on my pizza. But I guess I reached a certain point in my life where I'm like, I know a lot of people who really like mushrooms. Is there something I'm missing out here? So what I tried to do was to expose myself to mushrooms in a bunch of different dishes. And now I absolutely love mushrooms. So I think you can sort of, it's like education, that word education, where you're leading onto something. You really can, I think, train yourself to find something pleasurable. For example, probably when I was in high school, I tried reading Plato and Cicero and these authors, and I did not find, I found just dreadfully boring. But by sort of wading into philosophy from a certain angle, I've come to a point where I can really find this pleasurable. So something has changed, right, from where I was 10 years ago to where I am now. I don't think in either case I really chose to find it pleasurable. What I chose was to expose myself to it in different lights, in different, from different angles, through a different lens, and to find the pleasure that was there all along, but that was hidden from me because I wasn't really looking at it correctly. Is that making any sense at all?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
So, I don't think I can choose to find something pleasurable, but I could choose to open up to whatever pleasure happens to be in a given experience. And I guess that's a very subtle difference, but I think it's an important one.
Possibly one of these situations where there's many aspects to something and many different explanations that have validity depending on the perspective that you have at a particular moment. And I guess that's how we got into that, is that even though I agree with Don that I much prefer the word guide, but there would be contexts in which the word leader would apply probably as well. So it depends on the context in which you're evaluating the situation.
And that's the lovely thing about going back to the original Latin, that you can bring out all those different flavors flavors of meaning and all those different connotations and all those sorts of things. Whenever you stick with one word in English that you sort of already know, it's like, okay, well, that's what that is. But you go back and you look at what was actually written, you're like, oh, this is a little bit more deep than what I had originally thought. I will say I've been, I don't know whether wrestling is the right word, but I've been pondering the idea that, because we often say that, pleasure is the goal, pleasure is that. But I'm still wondering whether, and just in our conversation here today, whether pleasure and pain are the guides that you use to get to the goal, which is a pleasurable life. And I'm wondering, or your blessed life or your fortunate life or whatever, whether that's the ultimate goal and that pleasure is the means to get there. I'm still wrestling with the whole idea of, because I go back and forth on whether, capital P pleasure is the goal or whether it's, that pleasurable life writ large. And I'm not sure whether that's a difference or whether that's just wordplay or whether that's, so I'd be interested to hear any of your takes on that.
I vote for wordplay.
Martin, that is such a succinct way of stating the position. That's
okay. Done. We are done. Okay.
Joshua, well, unless Martin would like to elaborate, although I think he was very clear with those few words. Martin, you want to elaborate?
No need to elaborate more.
Okay. Joshua.
Could you restate the question? I know it has something to do with. Go ahead.
Well, I'm wondering, the Epicurean goal of, we often say that pleasure is the goal, and I'm still, because Epicurus himself uses, the goal in the telos and talks about things other than specifically the word pleasure. And there's the blessed life, the Makarios Zane, the happy life, eudaimonia, those sorts of things are sometimes pulled out as, because the goal of this is, a pleasurable life, or the goal of this is, happiness, or that sort of thing. Is that the goal, and pleasure is the way to that goal, or is pleasure the goal itself? And I think Martin has said, it could very well just be wordplay, but that's one of those things that because the word pleasure is not necessarily always said by Epicurus or the other early Epicureans as the goal. There's other things that are called the goal, but does it just mean that, pleasure writ large is really the actual goal? And that probably didn't help clarify my question at all. But
no, Joshua now has a complete grasp of the question and is about to answer in absolute terms that will enlighten generations to come.
I'm not sure that I'm going to do that, but I am going to make a bowling analogy. I can't remember the last time I went bowling, but when you're a kid and you go bowling, right? They put up those rails for you,
right?
Don, I'm trying to get the sense. Are you talking about pleasure and pain as being each side of the rail? And that, too far. Yeah.
And that striking, all the pins is the pleasurable life at the, is as the goal.
Okay. So the sort of the momentary, day-to-day pleasures, that's one of the rails. The other rail is pain. And then by playing the game over time, you reach what the actual goal is, which is sort of a pleasurable life writ large. And that is, in bowling, that'd be like the high score or whatever.
Right.
Is that your example? I don't know. Cassius, what do you think about that?
That wasn't my example, but that's a good example. I could go along with that analogy.
I do not think you have carried out your assignment yet, Joshua, of answering that question. So it's too early to bounce it back to me. Have you got anything further other than a bowling analogy to answer the biggest questions of life?
I think that
I do think that's the metaphor I was going for. So I applaud you for coming up with that on the fly.
Yeah, there's like a machine component I was trying to think of that I couldn't think of the name of, and then I thought of that instead. So
Joshua, why do you think Martin categorized the question as basically wordplay?
Well, okay, so we're talking about the difference here between the momentary day-to-day or even moment-by-moment pleasures versus the goal, which is a pleasurable life taken all together as a whole, right? That's the idea we're trying to distinguish.
Or he's asking, how do you even analyze that question? It's really a very basic question about, are we even on the right track by talking about it in this way?
Yeah, I don't think I have a great answer to that.
I guess one of my questions just right out of the box would be, is it a valid, I mean, as Martin has said, it could very well just be wordplay that I'm trying to just confuse the topic, but is it even a valid question, or is it just definitionally challenged, or what?
Right. Can I make another analogy? I know that
By all means.
my analogy is just bad. Okay, when you're dealing with young Earth creationists, you run into this problem over the theory of evolution where they'll say, okay, I accept microevolution, where you have minor changes within a species.
Mm-hmm.
But what I don't accept is macroevolution, where you have changes from one species to another. And the sort of the counter argument to that by the scientific community is there's no distinction between these two things. Macroevolution is just a bunch of little incidences of microevolution all coupled together.
Right.
And so a life of pleasure, if that's the goal, is just a bunch of little pleasurable moments throughout your life all coupled together. Right. There's no real difference between these two. I think I might be agreeing with Martin here that there's some wordplay going on because I don't know quite how else to put that.
I like that one too. You're on fire, Joshua. You are on fire.
But see, the problem is I don't like arguing by analogy because if you've got a point to make, you ought to be able to state it in plain language without bringing in bowling and the theory of evolution. But,
those are just illustrative examples. I think you've done a good job there.
Yeah, it's to me, it's like, I believe in one, but I don't believe in a million. Well, if you believe in one and you add a whole bunch of ones together, you come up with a million. So, if a pleasurable life writ large is the goal, then your day-to-day momentary pleasures are sort of, you got to bank those in a sense. You've got to choose those. So
or even if you choose a particular pain right now, my go-to example is always exercise. I exercise because I want to lead a healthier, longer, pleasurable life. So without illnesses and things like that. So that's the pain that you go through for the pleasure down the road. So
yeah, you're trying to get a large positive balance in your pleasure bank account, and occasionally a pain debit from that account is necessary so that you can accrue a larger pleasure credit, and then at the end of your life, all those little deposits that you've made sort of come together to form this mass whole that is a life of pleasure.
So what's the Greek the Greek saying that judge no man happy until he's dead?
Oh yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from, but
well, I think it basically. I mean, I've always took it to mean that you can't, you don't know what's going to happen up until the moment that you die. So it's like, be careful what you don't be too short.
And presumes, therefore, that you can somehow look at the man's life and conclude, based on these observations, he's lived a happy life or not. You yourself can make that judgment about that other person.
I think it might even have been, basically like a subjective thing too. I mean, don't be too sure. I mean, stay vigilant and make sure, and in this case, make sure you're pursuing pleasure because things can go off the rails.
Is happiness a feeling or a concept or both?
Oh, Lord, what have I done?
Well, my perspective to jump in at this moment in all of our discussions over the last couple of months and weeks about this would be to point back to the analogies that I think we've all used recently that I associate with Don lately in terms of how the map is not the same as reality, and how Martin has been talking about that propositional logic is, and mathematics, those things that we've discussed, they are models that are useful to us, but they don't constitute reality themselves. And my perspective in answer to that question today would be that that's why Martin's wordplay answer rang true to me. We're making an effort to draw a map. We're making an effort to understand some formulas in math and so forth, but it's always going to fall short in my mind. I think that's where I'm concluding in October of 2021 that our goal or our effort to capsulize these things in words is always going to fall short, and maybe that it's really important for us to recognize that they're always going to fall short for the same reason that mathematics and maps fall short. And that all of this that we're doing is, I think, a construction of our minds, analogies that we're coming up with to help us grasp something that is going on. But in the end, I think, and this is what we talked about last week, I think maybe there's something just really profound in Epicurus' argument about the reason you accept that pleasure is desirable is you point to it. You point to how all of these many examples of young animals pursuing pleasure, how we feel it without processing it through reason, and that ultimately life is an experience and not a concept.
Yeah, Cassius. Okay, so this whole map versus the territory thing is great because this is like my career is making maps. I do that every single day.
Yes.
Part of the problem with making maps, I do it in a commercial setting. So ultimately the goal there needs to be profit. And in order to make a profit, you can't spend, you've got a budget, you can't spend your whole life making a map of one parcel or one lot. You have to sort of sketch it out in broad strokes in like a day or two and get it out of the office. And it's kind of the same way, I think, in philosophy. There's a moment when you have to, because we're not mortal, we are mortal, I should say.
Yes.
We're not immortal. We have a finite amount of time. We can't forever be obsessing over the map. At some point, we just have to set that aside and just go live, right? And so once you've established in broad strokes that pleasure is the goal of life or the end of life or the guide to life, at a certain point, you have to actually go do the thing, right? You have to go pursue pleasure and lead a life that, build a life that will lead to pleasure. And for that, you need the master builder, and that is Epicurus.
Nicely done.
I very much agree with your comment there, Joshua, about the limitations on our time is a key aspect of all of this. There's an analogy in the legal frame as well that a lot of the law ends up being just a compromise with the fact that ultimately you have to come to finality. When people have disputes, I guess that maybe that's the point, is that at least in the United States, in our civil litigation system, people have disputes. They don't agree. They're probably never going to agree. At some point, you just have to bring finality to the situation. You'd like to think that you're being just. You'd like to think that you're in tune with some wonderful standards from God or nature, that you're doing the right thing. But in the end, you're not really even able to know for sure what the right thing is. All you can really do is bring finality to the situation, is come to a resolution right now and move on with life.
And that's a practical application too. It's like the thing that ran through my head as Joshua was talking to was the fragment of a philosopher's words are empty if they do not heal the suffering of mankind.
Yes.
Just as medicine is useless if it does not remove sickness from the body, so philosophy is useless if it does not remove suffering from the soul. It has to have a practical application.
I want to tie together an English word that you just used a couple of times, finality, with the Latin word used in the title of what we're talking about today, which is de finibus.
Right. Mm-hmm.
On ends. You have got to bring, you said you've got to bring finality to it. That seems to be Cicero's project here, is we've got to sort this problem out. He doesn't agree with Torquatus's conclusion, but I think I agree that this is a great text for at least attempting to do this. But then at some point, you got to go out and actually do it, in the world, not just in the book.
What's the aphorism? The meaning of life is a verb and not a noun.
The meaning of life is a verb.
Not a noun, because it's an active process. It's an active, you experience life. If you're looking for some sort of word that is the meaning of life or whatever, you're not going to get it. Life has to be experienced. And the reason we try and follow a particular philosophy is to make the most fortunate and blessed life that we can.
Which is an experience we expect to live through and feel, and is not just a definition or a concept floating in our minds that we'll never actually experience. If we don't eventually experience something, I think that means pretty much that it's worthless to us. Death is nothing to us, and I can't quote the rest of it either. I should be reprimanded for my inability to have that memorized.
Join the club.
Because that which has no sensation is nothing to us, and there's more to it even than that. But
we are, death is not, and when death is come, we are not. Yeah.
Right.
I was not, I was, I am no more, I don't care. Isn't that the phooey, non-phooey?
Right, that's right. And in the formulation that I attribute to my great leader, Norman DeWitt, the line that I remember from his book is that pleasure and pain have no meaning except to the living. All of the stuff that we're talking about, it has no meaning to us unless we, and in that sense, when he says living, I think he's talking about experience. Unless we're alive, unless we can feel it and experience it. We're probably going to have to talk about coming to an end of this particular episode before too much longer. But boy, this part of it, I think, is a very good place for us to find an ending, since we're talking about endings. That in the end, we're debating between experiences versus, is it concepts? Is it ideas? Maybe idea is the better word, since that's the Platonic version. Is that Plato and these other guys, they're suggesting, and virtue in a very strong sense is kind of another idea.
Maybe experience versus ideals.
Yes. But unless we can experience them, the ideals, I guess that's the definition of impracticality. We could say that an ideal that can't be experienced is impractical.
Right.
But then you have to just dive down into what does impractical mean? Whether you can put it into practice or not, whether you can actually experience it or not, whether it's real.
And I will say that we got past, I think, section 33 or whatever line or whatever you're saying. But I really think that the rest of those ones that we read at the beginning of the episode today are basically restating what we've been talking about. So I think he's saying the same thing in different ways all the way up through line 36. So I think that we've done a pretty good job, I think, of sort of covering the material. So I think that we can move along on the next episode as well. But I encourage people to go back and read those sections and sort of cogitate on the different permutations that are in those other sections.
I do want to talk just a little bit about section 36 itself, or paragraph 36. He says, and these principles, this is what Don was just talking about, have a wide application. There is one field in which the eloquence of your school has been wont especially to vaunt itself, and your own eloquence in particular, for you are an eager investigator of the past. I mean the stories of illustrious and heroic men, and the applause of their actions viewed as looking not to any reward, but to the inherent comeliness of morality. So the idea that you look to the past to come up with examples of, these are not just events that happened. This is history, which is used to instruct a sense of morality for the people. And then he says, all such arguments are upset when once the principle of choice, which I have just described, has been established, whereby either pleasures are neglected for the purpose of obtaining pleasure still greater, or pains are incurred for the sake of escaping still greater pains. That one's got to hurt a little bit for Cicero when he hears that. One of the things that Cicero is sort of famous for in a small way, I mentioned that he was the quaestor in Lilybaeum, which I think was the Roman capital on the island of Sicily. And one of his great achievements there was that he found the grave of Archimedes, which had been lost. In fact, it had been lost to a point where the citizens of Sicily thought that Archimedes was sort of a mythological character. He didn't really exist. But Cicero found his grave. And so Cicero going to the past to come up with these heroic men and then sort of make morality plays about their life and how we can apply that to our own life. But Torquatus says, all such arguments are upset when once the principle of choice, which I have just described, has been established. So these great men that you want to eulogize, even they were doing what they were doing, engaged in the pursuit of pleasure. Not virtue, not duty, but pleasure.
And the choices are the important things.
Yes.
And we can still do that, in the present, and that's what Torquatus is saying. It's like we're making the same choices that they're making, so we don't really need to look to them as exemplars. We can make these choices on our own.
I think what we need to do to bring this episode home is to now decide if there's any other isolated points like that we want to be sure to include in today's episode before we stop, because I know that you guys have just raised one of those in my mind, which I do not want to let this episode go by, in terms of confronting Cicero and confronting what many modern Stoics today would talk about here too. Torquatus, we have not read all of the detail. In fact, some of the material that we did not read before this section is where Cicero first raised the issue of the Torquatus family. But we need to be very specific about what's being talked about here. This Torquatus is justifying his family's military history on Epicurean grounds. And not only a military history, but this particular episode that they're talking about was a very famous, I think, Roman episode where one of the Torquati sentenced his own son to death because his son had been too aggressive in beginning I get this picture of a line of battle or something. He must have decided to run out ahead of the rest of them to start the battle himself before he received the order to do so. So this is a very military example that we're talking about here, after which this leader Torquatus sentenced his son to death for having violated the rule. I don't think they lost the battle. He could have easily have decided to reward his son for what he had done, but he decided that for whatever reason, as he evaluated it, that he was going to sentence his son to death, and he executed him. So this particular set of examples that we're confronting with here is something that people today need to understand as one of the controversial aspects of some of these passages. The assertion is being made here in these ancient Epicurean texts that there is no reason that an Epicurean would not be just as militaristic if the circumstances called for it, or active or aggressive, or even executing somebody, doing things that we don't normally associate with Epicurean attitudes or Epicurean activities. This Torquatus is being very aggressive here in saying that all of these things can be reconciled with Epicurean philosophy, because the ultimate goal is where you have to keep your focus. So that goes back to Principal Doctrine 10, which Don has raised earlier, and it's a very complicated and important thing to think about how you can relate all these things together. But this whole episode here is an in-your-face, aggressive counter to all of these Stoic arguments, to the very argument that Cicero was making, that you can't be a good citizen and be an Epicurean at the same time, that society and everything will just totally fall apart if you become Epicureans, because all you'll be doing is sitting in your cave playing games and looking for pleasure all day. And Torquatus, and obviously at this point in 50 BC, the Epicurean text and the Epicurean leaders were confronting those arguments and absolutely throwing them back at Cicero and the Platonists and the Stoics and the Aristotelians, and defending themselves. There's no absolute set of good things to do, and to some extent no absolute set of bad things to do. That morality is contextual.
Well, Cassius, you mentioned this example of the son who broke formation.
Right.
Formation is absolutely key to the Roman military strategy, because every single one of the legionnaires had this huge shield, which they carried on their left arm. Half of your shield protects you, half of your shield protects the guy to your left. And so when you break formation, not only are you putting yourself in danger, you are exposing the guy to the left.
Opening up a hole in the line.
Exactly. So by executing his own son, which must have been difficult for him, we could tie that back into, the Iphigenia and Lucretius and all that. But in this particular case, he's saying that it wasn't virtue necessarily or duty that caused him to do that. He had the specific goal of, reinforcing the importance of formation on the battlefield, and that this is going to save people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And life is important.
And maybe raise, the esteem of his troops, raise him in the eyes of his own troops too. So he had sort of that thing in mind too, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because if you're going to execute anybody else for doing it, if your own son does it and then you don't, you immediately lose any respect you had with the army.
Exactly. Yep.
I'd relate it to the example of how Epicurus said you'll occasionally give your own life for the life of a friend. If you're willing to give your life for something, you have to reconcile that with pleasure as well. And it can be done. And that's what Epicurus is suggesting has to be done, by asking that no matter what it is you're about to do, what's going to happen to you if you make this choice.
Right.
All right, I suppose we have no choice but try to bring this episode to a conclusion. Are there other points anybody would like to raise before we make closing comments?
Yes, so I want to follow up on this example with executing the son. So there are more examples in literature, somewhat earlier than what had happened by the Torquatus. Is also mentioned in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, that an over-eager soldier who went ahead of the army was also executed, and in this case, it wasn't obvious to the sub-leaders why he had to be executed, and the general then explained to enforce this discipline, so that not only those who lag behind get punished, but to keep this army all together, to keep its strength, then also those who against orders step ahead need to be basically killed in order to prevent this from happening again. So this is one aspect on this. But I totally disagree with this complete view on this one. I mean, of course, there were not many options in that time in executing this. But I think this is a violation of the contract not to harm each other. And there should be other ways found to punish this. So that than killing people. So the death penalty, I think, was still the wrong choice in all these cases. I remember there's another case illustrated in literature that was about the struggle of the medieval age of Jan Hus. So in one play on this one, he had his sister executed because she was working as a whore, no? And he had made a law that this must not be done.
Well, we're not going to be able to resolve those examples today. You've certainly raised the exact issue that we're going to be dealing with later on in this passage when we start talking about justice as well, and whether there are any absolute rules. And I suspect even as we discuss it right now, I think we can quickly deal with this aspect of it. Are you suggesting that the death penalty is always wrong? That Epicurus might have said that the death penalty is always wrong?
Maybe not necessarily always, but in all these contexts, I see pass out. So that means the real leader would have foreseen that this is a problem and devised a different method of discipline than this.
Right.
And you see this in more modern armies. So I didn't hear of this that during World War II or World War I, deserters among the Allied forces would have been executed, whereas in the German, at least in World War II, the German Reichs, where it was common practice that deserters would be executed.
And it seems like the Romans, everything was the death penalty back in ancient Rome. So
yeah.
The death penalty for parking violations kind of thing.
Well, I think to put a period to that section of what we're discussing today, I think we have to keep in mind that the question of whether there are any absolute rules, for example, it's very easy for us today. All of us would immediately recoil at the idea of, for example, somebody suggesting that slavery is a good idea or could even be a good idea under any circumstances. There's all sorts of examples that you could give of things that we find abhorrent, and the question of whether we find something abhorrent can ever translate into something that is an absolute rule is a very important question to examine at length. And that's what we'll be discussing as we continue through these episodes, and specifically when we get to the justice section. So let's talk about closing comments for today. Martin, do you have anything further as a closing comment beyond what you just brought up?
No.
Joshua, closing comments for today.
Oh, the only thing I have to say, I feel a lot better about ending today. Last time it felt like we were totally bogged down, and I felt the immediate feeling I had with our last episode was that I had somehow wandered into Cicero's trap and that we were puppets, on his marionette strings. I for some reason don't feel that way today. It seems like we're getting a handle on this somehow. That's really my only closing thought.
Don.
Nope, this is a good place to plant our boundary stone.
Very good analogy. And to talk about Joshua's analogy, getting a handle on it, I'm thinking again as the days and weeks go by that getting a handle on this material very much involves the ideas of understanding the limits of math, the limits of words, the limits of philosophy even. I suppose even philosophy itself or wisdom itself, it's all the same thing. It's exactly what we're going to be discussing in coming weeks here from this passage. None of those things are in themselves, in the abstract, worth living for. Worth living for means worth experiencing, I guess. And in the end, whether we can experience it or feel it or sense it seems to be the direction that Epicurus is pointing to, and he's using words and giving his philosophical conceptual arguments to help us understand that. But I think that's what you're saying at the end of the last episode you were struggling with about whether we were caught in Cicero's trap or whether we're caught in Plato's trap or just caught in the trap of philosophy in general. Is it in fact a trap to think that we can logically reason our way to a moment-by-moment guideline or formula that would tell us how to live our lives? And I think the answer to that's probably no. We can develop our maps and our mathematics, and we can employ them as tools. But if we ever make the mistake of thinking that those tools are ends in themselves, then I think we've lost our way. I think that's what Epicurus is saying. And we'll have to struggle from week to week to decide the answer to Don's question about whether capital P pleasure is the best way to describe what we're talking about or whether there's some better way. But I do think we have a handle on the problem. So I guess hearing no further comments, we'll close for the day and come back in another week or so. So thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Good.